about. And now, Cicely McWilliam, who's the Director of Policy and Government Relations for Save the Children Canada. So that's an international NGO. And Cicely has a long history of delivering advocacy and mobilization, communication, media strategies, and significant experience in terms of training and mentoring staff and volunteers, and also knowledge of the kind of political realities. She was former senior advisor for policy and campaigns at Save the Children, and then before that was communications officer and constituency assistant for the New Democratic Party of Canada. So political experience, and now working for an international NGO. It really doesn't come any better. So over to you, Cicely.
So I'm not entirely sure how I'm supposed to follow Michael, I have to say. But maybe what I can start with is by saying that, maybe telling you you've heard who I am, and maybe I should tell you a little bit about who Save the Children is. So there are a lot of the children organizations nowadays, but Save the Children was actually the first children's organization in that sense. We were founded by this kick-ass woman by the name of Eglantine Jebb, who came out of the suffragette movement in England. And after World War I, you may or may not know this, but there were blockades that were keeping food from the children, the enemy children in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And she saw pictures and witnessed these children with bloated bellies and thin arms, and you know, it was shocked that we could essentially blame the children in the parlance of the day for the sins of the father. And she went to Trafalgar Square with, you know, pictures of these children, and was demanding that people look at them and get them involved and try to raise money to send food and break the blockade. So she was arrested. And she spent a night in jail, and she went before the magistrate and was able to convince the magistrate not only to let her go, but to give money. So that's where we come from in terms of our activism. The other thing that she did was she was the first person to actually write the Declaration on the Rights of the Child, or Declaration of Geneva, which eventually did become the Convention on the Rights of the Child in a next iteration. And it really did say for the first time not only that you know, children had individual rights separate from their parents. And that was pretty impressive at the time. So that's where we come from. And over 100 years, we've gone through periods where we are more active as an organization and more activist as an organization, and we go through periods where we are more institutional as an organization. We are in the process of coming into a more activist mode, so I'm very happy about that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the MDGs, because there were some successes. Things could have been better. We didn't reach the goals that we had set for ourselves with the MDGs, but they did provide, particularly as it relates to health, some clear laneways that we should sort of go down. It was problematic from the start that they didn't have zero goals for any of these, these efforts. And that they were, we should save 2/3 of children, not all children, 2/3 of children. But they did help us sort of focus our attention, and we were able to move down a path. And so we can sort of look to that and say, okay, well, that was a good start. But it wasn't enough. And so we now have a new challenge. And that new challenge is the Sustainable Development Goals, which I don't know, I'm assuming this is a pretty activist crowd. I've got a bit of a sense of the different communities that you come from. So you're probably pretty up on the SDGs, but as you know, there's like 17 goals, and they go across the entire spectrum of development, from health to, environment to, inclusive growth. And so, but there is a chunky section on health. And so what's good about it is that there are some clear zero goals there. It's about this question that Michael raised around what is tolerable inequity. Well, we finally have some guidance that says there is no level of tolerable inequity when it comes to preventable deaths, certainly, and when it comes to a few other things. So that's kind of putting us on a trajectory, and that's a good thing. But what is it at the heart of the SDGs which makes them quite a bit different than the MDGs? And I would say it isn't just the technical targets and all the rest. It is actually at the center. The real difference is this conversation around equity. That is what it will drive and will help us to accomplish what we need to. And so that is something that didn't exist with the MDGs. So what's the uncomfortable truths? Well, we have some of them here. I mean, when you look at the numbers of children that still are dying, the numbers of children that are still hungry, the numbers of children living in conflict-affected states, there's a big job ahead of us. And it is going to require, as Michael suggested, a massive, I hate this very 80s term, but a massive paradigm shift in order for us to accomplish what we need to accomplish. But I would want to point out one specific thing that I think is particularly salient from my point of view, that 2/3 of children living in health and nutrition poverty in low and middle income countries are headed by a person of ethnic or racial minority. Racism. Poverty is racialized in this country and in all countries. And so that, to me, is something that really is quite fundamental. And again, as Michael was saying, that when you're actually looking at poverty, income is, of course, absolutely important, but it is not the only indicator. And multidimensional poverty is about health poverty, education poverty. It all feeds into the same dilemma. So we're focusing on reaching the most excluded children, is how we're phrasing it. And what do we mean by that? So poverty plus discrimination equals exclusion. And when we talk about that, when I say oversight, I don't mean that they're actually being looked over. I mean they're being forgotten. And perhaps I should have used forgotten. Forgotten, neglected, and deliberately left behind. That's what we mean when we talk about excluded children. And we see it, of course, in our own context here in Canada. The colonial policies that Indigenous children and Indigenous communities have faced over the last 100+ years are all about deliberate neglect, or deliberate exclusion, neglect, and just being completely forgotten or ignored. So exclusion here is represented, and we look at it from the child at the center, but we have to unpack exclusion at the household level, at the local level, at the national level, at the international level. And that's what an NGO or an INGO like Save the Children is trying to hit each and every one of those. So for example, when we deliver programming at the household level, it's not enough for us to sort of have an anti-poverty program, like a women's economic empowerment program, because you can empower a woman economically, but if you don't do so in a way that's child sensitive, and by that I mean is a program that's built to benefit most a child and do no harm, that woman may take that economic empowerment support, whether that's money, whether that's training, what have you, and as she builds out her livelihood, whatever it is, her farm, her shop, she may need additional help in the household or in the shop, and she'll take a child, usually a girl child, out of school to help her either in the home or at the shop in order to make more money for the broader family. I don't condemn her for that. It's not a judgment call, but that is often what we see when you build out a program that is blind to the child's sensitivity of the program. So at the household level, you have to look at that. If you're doing a food assistance program, or if you're doing some kind of nutrition program, are you also talking to that family about how it's as important to feed the girl child as it is to feed the boy child? So these are the kinds of things at the household level that you're talking about when you're looking at inequity. And then at the local level, of course, then it's where you get into these differences between groups of people and gender and all the rest. At the national level, it's in between states, and it's about trying to create that, I would say the reparation that is owed between rich states and poor states, because we have our wealth as Canada and as the North has come from the exploitation of the South in many respects. So what is it that we owe? And is that official development assistance? Is that a better trade agenda? Is that fairer trade? What does all that look like? So you have to look at it at the national, at the international level, and the national level, it's in between rural, urban, rich, poor. So when we are talking about ending exclusion or dealing with exclusion, we're talking about it about looking at discriminatory barriers. So laws and policies, norms and behavior, and also even just at the basic level, who's counted and who's not. Around the world, poor children from ethnic minorities and racial minorities, girls, are simply not even documented. So they don't even get to the point where they can demand their rights in terms of legislative rights. They're invisible. So you have to get right down to that level. And then you have to tackle the financial barriers. And so inadequate resources for an entire government. We talk a lot about governments investing in children. And so what are they spending on their health budget? What are they spending on their education budget? But then there's also the high direct and indirect and opportunity costs. So just as an example, right now the SDGs are in the final throes, I think, at this point of nailing down indicators. 17 goals, 107 indicators. One of the things that we've lost as an important indicator around universal health coverage is out-of-pocket expense. And so that means that we're not going to be measuring the out-of-pocket expense that people have to pay in order to access universal health coverage or health coverage at all. How are we going to know how much seeking health is actually impoverishing people because it's coming out of their own pockets? And the World Bank and the WHO proposed an indicator, and that indicator has been rejected by many countries in Africa, and it's been rejected because they're worried that it will inhibit them from developing a private insurance sector and microinsurance for the poor. So I just want to tell you quickly, we're launching, and we have launched, something called the Every Last Child campaign. And so that's our 3-year campaign that's looking to really explicitly tackle this and to raise this and to kind of, to be honest, refresh the activism within Save the Children. And that our strategic objective for 2018 is to remove discriminatory and financial barriers that stop children from surviving and learning, with the target of reaching 15 million children. That's our goal. That's what we're committing to try and do as an international NGO. And it's quite exciting for me. And the way we're doing it is we have 3 calls to action. And I think that this is important for this group to think about, is what are the calls to action in each of your own areas of focus? And as Janet was saying, how do we collectively raise our calls to action to the leaders in our country and broadly speaking? So we have 3 primary calls to action: a New Deal for displaced children, so that's forcibly displaced children, refugee children, children who are displaced because of climate, a guarantee for girls, but I would like to specify that's with a gender equity lens, right? Don't forget the role of men and boys in achieving gender equality and gender equity in this conversation. And I think, again, Michael pointed out a perfect example how men and boys can really make a stand on gender equity. And then a global safety net for children. And this is this idea around the responsibility. Governments have the duty to invest in children. They have the international legal duty to invest in children. So what are their budgets for the basic needs of children? And we have, within the 3 guarantees, we have 3 areas that we're looking at. We're talking about fair financing. So for everything from how are governments investing in children to minimum financial security for all children. And that would be where we would bring the conversation around something like a minimum basic income, and how that raises equity within a culture. We have the discriminatory norms or discriminatory barriers under equal treatment. And then we have the accountability, better disaggregated data. Governance at all levels includes children. And budget transparency. So one of the things that we do, and again, something that Michael referenced at the end of his presentation, is that we train kids on how to do budget tracking. How to go into a clinic, for example, and do an audit of what's available in that clinic, and then working with their families, their parents, their communities, go and look and see, what did the federal budget say should be in this clinic? Do we have all the syringes that they said we should have? Do we have the nurses? Do we have the doctor? And then we mobilize them with partners, not just us, but local partners we work with. We mobilize them to go back and say, we need this. It was in the budget, why isn't it here? And a perfect example of that, and I'll just, is in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone came up with a plan to provide free health care for mothers and children under 5 and lactating women. Pregnant women, lactating women, and children under 5. And 3 years in, they're like, okay, we're done. We've done what we said we would do. We've reached the women we said we would reach. And they quietly tried to pull the money back. It just so happened that they started to do that in that budget cycle right at the time that that Save the Children and our community partners were collecting and aggregating the data from a series of budget tracking projects from around Sierra Leone. So we put the gas on doing the analysis, released that, and then the government was incredibly embarrassed because not only did they not reach everybody that they said they were going to reach, they committed to spend, but none of the money actually hit the ground, or little of the money hit the ground where they said it would. But then they also showed that there was a demand for that, for these services in these communities. And so they relented and kept the money in the budget for this program. So we're very pleased by that. But that children, even young children, can be quite involved in this kind of work with the right kind of support and training. So I was going to have a video, but it didn't work. But what I will say is that Save the Children has now committed, well, we've always committed to do this because it's in our DNA, but it's, as I said, there's ebbs and flows of engagement, and I'm really pleased to be part of Save the Children at a moment in our history when we have recommitted to doing whatever it takes to reach the last child, every last child, in terms of survival and education. And I would challenge everybody here to engage in this process. The SDGs are not just going to succeed if we have academics and implementers, and it needs political will, it needs political pressure. Everybody can do their part, but you can't do it you can't do it separate from the political process, and you can't do it separate from activism. So I would really encourage us all to think about how within our own spheres of influence, how within our own work, we can turn that into political and social change that mobilizes people here in Canada and people around the world. Thank you.